The wind had a strange way of talking out in the fields at night. It didn't just howl, it whispered, carried secrets across the hills and fence lines, like voices too old to remember but too strong to disappear. That night it was louder than usual, and old Frank Miller could feel it deep in his chest, like something was coming. Something he couldn't quite name. Frank had lived on the same patch of land for 63 years. Born in the same room where he now slept, under a quilt stitched by his mother before her hands gave out, in a house that groaned like an old man every time the wind hit it just right. The farm was all he had left. The crops, the soil, the smell of rain coming, the creak of the barn door. That was his whole world now. He wasn't always alone. Once there'd been laughter in the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon in the mornings, tiny muddy boots by the door, and songs hummed off-key while hanging laundry in the sun. But life had a way of taking things before a man was ready. His wife, May, passed away 11 years ago. Cancer came like a thief in the dark and took her fast, and their only boy, Lucas, left 2 years after that, trying to outrun grief in a city that didn't remember his name. Now it was just Frank, the wind, and the silence. That night, just past midnight, the silence was heavier than usual. Frank had gone to bed early, his knees aching from the cold creeping up through the floorboards. He hadn't bothered lighting the fire. No one to keep warm but himself, and he figured he could take it. He always had. But just as he started to drift off, there it was. A knock. Sharp. Sudden. Out of place. 3 steady raps against the wooden door. Frank's eyes snapped open. His heart stuttered in his chest, not because of fear exactly, but because nothing good ever came knocking at midnight. Not in these parts, not anymore. He stayed still, listening. Maybe it was the wind again. Maybe a loose branch, but then, there it was again. 3 knocks, softer this time, but clear. He sat up slowly, the quilt falling to the floor. The room was cold. The kind of cold that crept into your bones and made you feel older than you were. Frank swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood, every joint in his body reminding him of the years he'd earned. He grabbed the flannel shirt off the back of the chair and slipped it on, then shuffled down the hallway toward the front door. His hand hovered over the latch. Whoever it was, they hadn't knocked again. Maybe they'd gone. Maybe it was a prank. But his gut told him otherwise. He opened the door just a crack, and there, standing in the moonlight, was a boy, barefoot, maybe 8, maybe 9 years old. Thin jacket, jeans too short, hands shaking around something wrapped in paper. His hair was messy, and his eyes, those wide, uncertain eyes, looked up at Frank with a kind of tired hope that didn't belong on a child's face. "Please," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I sit here a while? I won't steal nothing." Frank stared at him. For a second he thought he might be dreaming, but the cold air slicing through the open door said this was real. Too real. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in, son," he said quietly. The boy hesitated, then crossed the threshold. Frank closed the door behind him, locking the wind outside. The boy's shoulders were hunched, like he expected to be hit or kicked out at any moment. Frank led him into the kitchen, turned on the overhead light, yellow and flickering, and motioned to the chair at the table. "Sit down. You hungry?" The boy nodded. That was all it took. Frank moved slowly, making toast, scrambling eggs, heating milk on the stove. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. The boy sat at the table, legs swinging, eyes darting around the room like a trapped rabbit. When the food was ready, he ate like he hadn't had a meal in days. Frank sat across from him, hands folded, studying him. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Call me Danny," he said, then looked down like he wasn't sure if that was the truth. "Where you from, Danny?" The boy didn't answer. Frank didn't push. Something about the kid reminded him of Lucas when he was small, quiet, soft-voiced, always watching the world like it was something he didn't quite trust. When Danny finished eating, Frank handed him a blanket and pointed to the old recliner by the fireplace. The boy curled up without a word. Within minutes, he was asleep. Frank sat in the kitchen long after, watching the clock tick past 1, then 2. He didn't sleep. Not that night. Outside, the wind carried on, but something about it had changed. He didn't know who the boy was or why he'd come. But he knew enough to understand that knock at the door wasn't just a knock. It was the start of something. Something that might wake up a part of him he thought was long gone. Frank didn't tell anyone about the boy the next day. Out here, neighbors were few and far between, and word traveled slower than snowmelt. Besides, he wasn't even sure what he'd say. That a strange kid showed up at midnight, that he had no shoes and no answers. It didn't seem like something folks would understand without wanting to fix it their way. Call the sheriff, send the boy to a shelter, ask too many questions. Danny slept long and deep, curled in the recliner like he hadn't had real rest in weeks. When he finally stirred, the sun was already halfway up the sky and casting long stripes through the dusty windows. Frank was at the kitchen table, sipping weak coffee, staring at the fields outside like he always did. The boy rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly. "You didn't make me leave," he said, voice scratchy. "No reason to," Frank replied. "You sleep like you needed it." Danny nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't thank him. But his shoulders didn't look as tight as they had the night before. Frank handed him a bowl of oatmeal. They ate in silence, only the occasional scrape of spoon against ceramic breaking it. After breakfast, Frank motioned toward the back door. "Come on. I've got chores, and if you're staying here a bit, you might as well help." Danny followed without question. Out in the cold morning, the two moved through the land, checking the chicken coop, repairing a section of the fence, hauling feed. The boy was small, but he worked with quiet focus, never complained, never asked for breaks. Frank noticed how he watched everything, like he was memorizing the layout of the place, maybe in case he needed to run again. By noon, Frank finally asked the question that had been sitting on the tip of his tongue. "You run away from somewhere?" Danny didn't answer right away. He was spreading hay in the goat pen, his movements slower now. "Sort of," he said finally. "It wasn't good there." "Where was there?" "Foster place," he said, then added quickly, "Not the first one, just the last one." Frank didn't say anything. He just nodded, like he understood more than he said. And in truth, he did. The foster system wasn't something he knew much about firsthand, but he'd heard stories. Some good, most not. As the days passed, Danny stayed. Frank didn't push him to explain, and Danny didn't try to leave. They settled into a rhythm. Mornings started early with farm work. Afternoons were quieter. Sometimes they sat on the porch and watched the wind move through the trees, or they fixed old tools that had rusted from too many winters. At night, they read aloud from an old stack of books May had left behind. Frank hadn't touched those in years, but now he heard her voice in every page, warm and steady. But there was something else happening too. Frank found himself waking up, earlier, moving quicker, laughing at things he hadn't laughed at in years. He was remembering what it felt like to have someone near, not just someone to talk to, but someone who needed him. The boy had stirred something in him that he didn't think he had left. Danny, too, began to change. He talked more, smiled sometimes, especially when Hank, the old farm dog, curled up beside him and licked his hand. He stopped flinching every time someone moved too fast or spoke too loud. There was still a wariness in him, a kind of sadness he kept close, but Frank could see the layers starting to peel away. One night, after they'd eaten stew by the fire, Danny spoke up. "You think some people just don't get picked?" Frank looked over. "Picked for what?" "For family. For love. For any of it." Frank leaned back in his chair. "I think sometimes life gets real unfair, but that don't mean you don't deserve good things. Sometimes it just takes longer to find 'em." Danny didn't reply, but he stayed up later that night, just sitting near Frank, watching the fire dance. A few days later, the trouble started. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled up the gravel drive just before dusk. Frank was in the barn, and Danny was feeding chickens. The moment he heard the car door slam, the boy froze like a deer caught in headlights. Frank stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evening, Sheriff." Sheriff Malone was a tall man with a tired face and a deep voice. "Frank," he said, nodding, "we got a report. Someone spotted a kid out here that matches a missing person case. Boy named Daniel Everett." Frank glanced at Danny, who was backing slowly toward the coupe. "He's here," Frank said, "but he came on his own. Ain't causing trouble. He's just a kid who needed some peace." Malone sighed. "I get it, but he's a ward of the state. If he's been reported missing, we've got to follow protocol." Danny turned and ran. The sheriff cursed under his breath, but Frank held up a hand. "Let me talk to him." He found Danny near the old orchard, crouched behind a tree, breathing hard. "They're gonna take me back," he whispered, eyes wide with panic. "I can't go back, Frank, I can't." Frank knelt beside him. "I'll talk to him. I'll make sure they listen. But you gotta trust me. I won't let them just drag you off. Not without trying." Back at the house, Frank and the sheriff talked for an hour. Frank told him about the midnight knock, about the boy's work ethic, his quiet spirit, his past. Malone listened. He didn't promise anything, but he agreed to hold off on moving the boy until social services could come out and evaluate the situation. The next few days were tense. A woman named Valerie from Child Services arrived, clipboard in hand, smile too practiced. She asked Danny questions that made him close up again, asked Frank questions that made him feel like he had to defend his own home. But slowly, something shifted. Neighbors began stopping by, dropping off pie or bread and offering quiet support. Turns out they'd seen the change in Frank. A man once buried in silence now stood taller, eyes clearer. Danny had brought something back to life out here. The social worker came back a week later. "We're not here to punish anyone," she said gently, "but this is unorthodox. We need to assess what's best for Daniel." "Ask him what he wants," Frank said. "He's old enough to know." That night, Danny stood in the living room, looking at the fireplace. "I want to stay," he said. "I don't care what name you put on it. This feels more like home than anywhere else I've been." The worker didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. The process, she explained, would take time. Background checks, legal steps, paperwork. Until then, Danny would have to be placed temporarily elsewhere. Frank's heart cracked when he heard it. "I'll fight," he said simply, and he did. He filed for emergency guardianship. Friends from town wrote letters. A retired teacher offered to tutor Danny from the farm. The sheriff even showed up in court to vouch for them both. But just as hope began to bloom, something happened. A man appeared. Late one evening, a truck pulled up the drive. A tall man with a scar on his cheek and a heavy jaw got out. He had a thick folder in his hand and a shadow in his eyes. "I'm looking for Daniel Everett," he said, voice hard. Frank stood on the porch, arms crossed. "Why?" "I'm his uncle," the man said. "Biological. They tracked me down. I'm here to claim custody." Danny watched from the window, silent. Frank didn't know what scared him more, the man's cold tone, or the fact that the law might now stand behind him. The boy, once abandoned, now found. But by who? That night, as the wind returned, cold and cruel, Danny sat quietly by the fire, not saying a word. Frank stayed close, a storm brewing in his chest. The knock that brought Danny here had changed everything. But what would happen now? Might tear it all apart. And the next knock might be the one that takes him away. The next few days passed like a storm without rain. Quiet, but charged. Frank felt the weight of every second, every word left unspoken. The man who claimed to be Danny's uncle, Gordon Everett, had legal documents. He'd been contacted by the state after Danny's file was updated. He wasn't listed before, hadn't even known the boy existed, he claimed. But now, there he was, standing on Frank's land with full legal rights and cold eyes that didn't flicker once when he looked at the child. Frank had seen a lot of men in his life. Men who hurt more than they healed. Men who wore power like armor and used silence like a blade. Gordon Everett looked like one of those men. Danny shut down again. He barely spoke, barely ate. The spark Frank had watched grow in him these past weeks flickered like a candle in the wind. The boy stayed near Frank but didn't touch, didn't ask questions. He just waited, like he already knew how this story would end, like he'd seen it before. Valerie from Child Services came again, trying to smooth things over. The law is the law, Frank. Blood family gets first say, unless we can prove danger or neglect. There's nothing in his record about this uncle. No prior complaint. No reason to deny placement. Frank stared her down. You didn't see Danny the night he arrived. You didn't hear the knock. That wasn't just a runaway, Valerie. That was a boy on the edge. Valerie sighed. We can't go on feelings. We need facts. We need proof. And then, one night, Frank found the proof. It was near midnight again, like the moment Danny first arrived. Frank had woken from a dream. May's voice had called to him, clear as a bell. He got up, walked outside to clear his head. That's when he saw Gordon Everett's truck parked crooked near the barn. He moved quietly through the shadows, and then he heard it. Raised voices, Danny's name, the unmistakable sound of fear. In a boy's whisper, Gordon had cornered Danny near the fence line. His voice was low, mean. You think you're gonna stay here forever? You're mine now. You don't get to choose anymore. Danny was shaking, his back pressed to the wooden post trying to disappear. Frank didn't wait. He stepped out, shotgun in hand, not loaded, but Gordon didn't know that. Step away from the boy, Frank said, voice even. Gordon turned, startled, then sneered. You threatening me, old man? I'm asking you to leave my property. Now. Gordon puffed up, angry, then looked at the shotgun, then at Danny. For a moment he looked like he might swing, might do something reckless. But he didn't. He stepped back, got in his truck, and peeled out down the gravel road. Frank called Valerie that night. Called the sheriff, too. They recorded statements, took photos of bruises on Danny's wrist. This time, it wasn't just Frank's word. There was real evidence. Enough to reopen the custody claim. The next few weeks were hard, full of court dates and interviews. But Danny spoke up this time. He told the judge everything. And when the final ruling came down, Frank stood with the boy's hand in his, and they both listened as the judge granted full guardianship to Frank Carter. Danny didn't smile right away. It took a few days. But when the paperwork was signed, when the final door had closed behind Gordon Everett and his threats, the boy finally let out a long breath. It was the sound of something leaving him, fear maybe, or just years of silence. That spring, they planted a new crop in the far field. Frank let Danny drive the old tractor. He wasn't very good at it, but he laughed, really laughed, when he nearly tipped it trying to turn too sharp. Frank laughed too, a deep sound that hadn't touched his throat in years. Neighbors dropped by more often. The local school offered part-time classes, and Danny made a few friends. Hank the dog followed the boy everywhere, like they were tied together by invisible thread. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the sky turned gold, Danny asked, "Why did you open the door that night?" Frank took a long breath. Because for the first time in a long time, someone needed me more than I needed silence. Danny nodded, quiet, thoughtful. "I'm glad you did." And Frank smiled. Not the kind of smile you wear for company, the kind that grows roots deep inside. So am I. The story of the lonely farmer and the midnight knock became something the town whispered about, a kind of local legend. But for Frank and Danny, it wasn't about mystery or drama. It was about second chances, about how sometimes the family we choose matters more than the one we're born into, and in a world full of locked doors and late hours, one knock had changed everything. Forever.